Okay. Made objects are built from the emotional intensity of the human condition. A violin contains the spirit of the builder, the power of the tree that gave the wood, the bond of each living cell to harness the vibrational energy, and the commitment to be a violin at the expense of the fallen tree, the toil of mastery, the urge of the violinist, and the longing of the ear that waits to hear it. This is something that Raffi sent to me in an email, and this is who we're going to be speaking with today. He just comes up with this stuff on the fly pretty much constantly. He's pretty much a literary genius, a design genius, and the best part is that he hasn't let it get to his head, and if you asked him, he wouldn't think so, but it's true. So Raffi is a transportation designer and industrial designer with over 30 years of experience. He's worked with clients like Toyota, Subaru, Rolls-Royce, McDonald's, Boeing, Mattel, Hasbro, and probably close to 200 others, right, Raffi?
Yeah, that's about right. I think
Yeah.
close to 200 now.
And, he's a pretty remarkable character. He built his first full-scale functioning concept car. It was in high school, wasn't it?
Yeah, I started it when I was 17 and finished it about 21.
Yeah, so this guy is no joke. He's probably one of the greatest designers I've ever met. He definitely shies away from the spotlight, but he is somebody who deserves a lot more recognition. The only reason why he hasn't gotten it is because he really just doesn't care. He really cares about his students. He's also a teacher at CCA, which you've been teaching at CCA since about 2007, 2008, and you were a teacher even before that, right, Raffi?
Yeah, I've taught at CCA now for about 15 years. And before that, I taught a number of different other places at University of Washington and a handful of other design-related institutions. I've always thought that education and teaching is a critical feature of being a designer, and also informing your own practice as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think teaching is probably one of the best ways to become a really good designer. I'm still on my way though. So anyway, this is the basic intro of Raffi. How's it going?
It's going great, John. It's nice to be here with you and good to chat about design, our favorite topic.
That's exactly right. So what's on your mind, Raffi? What have you been up to lately?
You know, it's really interesting. There's a lot happening these days. As young people are kind of looking out at the world from the past year, I think their experiences are changing, their observations about how they want to advocate for the world that they're entering, what they want to do with their creative capacity, and also their intellectual curiosity about how design and how manufacturing and industry and sustainable practices going forward can deeply inform what we want to do and how we want to impact the world.
That's really interesting, especially as it relates to sustainable practices. So
Absolutely.
one of the comments that I got on YouTube was to ask you, how do you feel? How do you feel about a lot of your products looking back, especially now thinking about some of the potential environmental impacts? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a question I get a lot because my work tends to involve the use of materials and practices that are, let's say, institutional in our industry. And a lot of those materials and practices have not been with the most sustainable ideation in mind. And because I participated in a lot of that, I've had time to sort of reflect on what all of that means in the context of my career. It's a challenging component, and I think if I were to start my career over as a young person today, I would integrate it more into my own personal aesthetic, because I do believe that it's not only important to think about these considerations and work towards these considerations, but to be part of a larger voice in a company that takes it seriously and works very hard on recycling, on sustainable practices, on effective material use. But for me, looking back on my career, it's difficult because one of the things I really enjoy as a designer is using the existing framework of technology, the existing culture, working within the way things developed during that period, and maximizing my potential as a creative person, weaving through that window of opportunity. So to have been somebody with more sustainable practice in mind on a large scale would have been extremely challenging. I've been very aware of designers from my youth, including Paulo Soleri, who was very much involved in sustainable practice architecture. Buckminster Fuller, also very involved in sustainable practices. I think for many designers, it's become a component of our landscape, and it's something to continue to consider. But once again, looking back on my career, working in those areas during those periods of time, I kind of had to frame it a little differently.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's really interesting. I just want to change this to speaker. So let me ask you, Raffi, on that note, were there any projects that you especially enjoyed throughout your career? Like what do you think is your favorite project, and what is it about it that was so fulfilling to you?
So it's interesting. It's hard to pick a favorite. There's probably 4 or 5 that I think were really impactful for me as a designer, to be able to see the first product I designed that was out in the marketplace. I remember going to see it, and it was a pool sweep for an above ground pool filtering system. And I remember actually going to a pool store that sold the product and walking down the aisle and seeing it, unexpectedly, and just jumping out at me. And that impact for being sort of the first time that I worked professionally, where I'd started from a sketch and moved to the tooling model and moved into the manufacturing, and then to see it actually on the shelf was a pretty rewarding thing. Of course, the car that I designed and built, big impact to me because it was something that I spent so much of my time working on. But I think one of the most important design aspects, if I have to answer with one thing, the most important project I think is, and this sounds a little arrogant, but it's me. It's and the me that I am is the person that really is able to now impart a lot of information, a lot of wisdom, a lot of focus and clarity to young students looking to pursue a career as a designer. I'm an ongoing prototype as a teacher. I'm not done. I hope that I continue to evolve and adapt my practices. So I would say that would be it.
That's really interesting. So this might be a similar answer, but is there a project that you found to be especially fulfilling? Because, it's not necessarily the case that the most exciting project or your favorite project is always the most emotionally fulfilling one, or the one that you felt had the most significance.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are a lot of things I've done kind of quietly or privately as a designer. I've done a lot of work on foundations, designing platforms and opportunities for youth-based education. The biggest design project, though, that I feel had the most impact for me was I designed an automobile in the 90s that was a fictional car around a story for a vehicle that never existed. And instead of designing for the future, I designed from the past. So I went back to the 30s and designed this Duesenberg as an imaginary car that never existed. And then I worked with my design partner on the project, and we built it around a framework for authenticity. So we aged all the drawings, we put together all the artifacts as though it were real, and we designed it on this premise that instead of designing a future concept, it was a past concept that could have some impact on the future. That project was about 25 years old now, and it still gets regular posting, regular citations from people who say, look at this, it's unbelievable. And a lot of people reflect not only on the vehicle itself, but the story that goes with it, which we designed into the concept itself.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'd love to see that. I'll have to pull it up for the YouTube video. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, Raffi, how do you come up with all of this poetic prose? Where does that come from? Like, how do you think of these like crazy metaphors and analogies and stuff? Because it's very Zen, and I have to like really sit down and think about this stuff, but it seems to just sort of flow freely in your case. Is that true? I guess that would be the first question.
Yeah, I think, as a kid, I was constantly challenged uh, by marking, let's just say that. So the idea that you could pick up a tool, use your hand, and then mark something with it, and the fact that it would stay there, and as long as the material remained preserved and undamaged, it would last. So as a kid, I loved the idea of hunting for, hidden artifacts or bones or archaeology. And and design to me felt like this sort of archaeological practice that involved the present, but had an impact on the future. So the idea of that was very dreamy to me. And as I thought more about it as a young person, I thought about how ideas, which don't really exist, they're just sort of electromagnetic plasma in your head, so to speak, how those things can become something. And the first form of their becoming was my speaking it. So if I had a dream, for example, in the middle of the night and woke up and I went and told my brother, I would explain it to him and I would speak it to him, and those words became something. So it was the earliest form, before I even knew how to control drawing, it was the earliest form for me to figure out how to convey what I was thinking, was to speak it. So storytelling, narrative composition, and then the imaginative construct around narrative. So describing something I could visually see, but then describing something that wasn't there at all. That became a really, really fascinating feature of design exploration for me. And of course, once I was old enough to start drawing and drawing really well, it was all over then, because there was another way to communicate and to see it. And I constantly, when I draw, I'm constantly sort of talking to the paper, and I'm kind of telling it a story as I'm trying to create what I'm building, so that I have a relationship with the artifact itself as it's becoming something. I kind of encourage it, and it seems to also encourage me back.
That's interesting. Do you think that it's possible to build a relationship with objects?
No, absolutely. I think that the most sensitive and aware designers are the ones that understand the value of objects, and that they have a presence, and their presence is worthy of our focus and attention. And when I say object, it can be a man-made object, but it could also be trees or rocks. Um, the idea being that anything, even for example, like the violin, or a musical instrument, or any type of tool, it has a presence that is composed of elements that have given to that object willingly. And and the idea behind the object being sort of this dumb thing, or a dead thing, or an object that has no value to you, is the equivalent of ignoring it. And I think the worst possible thing we can do with anything in our life is ignore it. Um, so so learning, for example, with your with your pen, it's an object that has a purpose, and our job is to emancipate the purpose from that object. And the only way to do that is with a really effective relationship.
So how do you go about building a relationship with an object? That is a tricky one. Now we're getting into real woo-woo territory.
So yeah, that is tricky, because it doesn't, to begin with, the opportunity, for example, you're drinking from a glass right now. So your relationship with the object is first the engagement. You reach out to it. And by reaching out to it, you're inviting your hand to have an experience with the touch of the glass. As a designer, this is super important. How that glass feels in your hand is critical to your understanding of the relationship. You not only understand the glass, but the minute you pick it up, you understand the weight of the water inside the glass. And then your body starts to understand the opportunity for drinking. So all of these messages are there for us. We just ignore them, or we dismiss them as a convenience of the fact that we have that kind of consistency, like the beating of your heart. this is, your heart is going on for some reason we don't know. It just willingly agrees to do it over and over and over again, solely for the purpose of sustaining you. And yet we don't really thank it. And if you think about the value of giving thanks to your heart, giving thanks to the opportunity to reach out and have a glass of water and drink it, it sounds a little silly, but in fact, it's that kind of graciousness, that kind of understanding that brings a sensitivity to all the things that we will create with our hands.
That's very interesting. It kind of reminds me of something that happened to me a few days ago. I was out surfing this spot that I will not name. And I was out there and, because of COVID-19 and everything, one of the few benefits of that is that a lot of people are working from home. And because of that, they can sneak out to go surfing in the middle of the day.
Sure.
So I was out surfing and I knew that it was going to get crowded. The tide was a little bit too high, but I knew that the tide was going to come down. It was going to get really good. And there was going to be a short window of time where there was just enough time to basically go surfing with nobody out. And it also being good enough, the optimal conditions, because people are not very, people are more reactive with this kind of stuff than they are sort of, predictive with these sorts of things. So
Sure.
I'm sitting out there are no waves. And I see somebody running up the beach. I'm like, oh man, I didn't even catch a wave and it's already over. I'm like, oh man, forget this. So I started thinking, I ask so much of this one particular surf spot. It's by far my favorite place to surf in the entire world. And I'm so lucky that it's right near where I live. I said, I ask so much of this surf spot, but what have I ever done for this place? And quite literally, right as I said that, this little piece of trash just sort of floats up right in front of me. This little Jolly Rancher wrapper. I say, oh, here's my chance. I pick it up. I put it in the sleeve of my wetsuit.
Yeah.
The guy's paddling out from the beach. And this wave comes seemingly out of nowhere. I catch the wave. It's by far the best wave of the day. I ride it all the way to the beach. And I kick out right where the guy is paddling out. And he says, that's the wave of the day. There's not going to be another wave like that. I said, well, we'll see. The waves are getting good. We'll see what happens. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, the wind came up. It was done.
Well, here's the thing about experiences like that. And this is what I think is so important. It's not that the fact that you plucked out a piece of trash from the water is actually going to magically make the best wave.
Yeah, of course.
But what it is, it's an opportunity for you to take an assessment of the broader picture. When you sit down and you draw on a blank sheet of paper, it doesn't exist like that. It's the most frustrating thing in the world to look at a blank sheet of paper and have to create something from it. So one of the things that happens in our thought process is because we live in a world where there's everything, there is no such a thing as a blank sheet of paper. We have to focus on what aspects of the composition out there we can impact. So by picking up that one piece of trash, you created a different focus around your next wave, so to speak. And when that wave comes, those two things get connected and it puts you in a different context. That's how you asked the question earlier. That's how I get ideas in my head. I put together those contexts constantly so that I don't have to write a script down. I'm constantly connecting all the parts and pieces in my head so that it comes together in a way that makes a fluid story.
But isn't it difficult to find the connections between things that are so disparate?
Yeah, because all over the world, there are tons of tiny Jolly Rancher wrappers that will never get picked out of the water.
Yeah, exactly.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the fact that you picked that one up is the equivalent of dozens of designers picking up one pen and putting their pen down on the paper and taking the time to create something that exists now on that paper that never has existed before and never will exist again. That's how impactful it is to have that kind of power and authority inside your hand in the relationship you have with the pen. You had, for a brief moment, a relationship with the ocean and the opportunity to impact it by removing that one object. It might just be a small moment to the ocean, but it was a large moment to you. And how you decide to live as a designer, as a person, as a member of the humanity in this tiny little wedge of time that we have is how you will see the broader picture of things. That's one of the things I try to teach inside my classes is not that we're drawing or shaping or forming objects of industry, is that we're impacting humanity with our objects. That's the goal, is to do some good with the ideas we have.
That's very interesting. You mentioned the temporality of sketching.
Yeah.
And that immediately made me think of music and your prolific music career. So, Raffi, well, first of all, let me ask you, do you have a band that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, I play, well, we haven't played in a while, but I play in a band called Westerly Sound. And it's three of us. We have a great time when we get together and play. We're three friends that, most of the bands that I played in over the years, I started out, I play violin and I play fiddle in bluegrass bands and folk bands and things like that. And most of them start out with just friends getting together to play. It's a conversation. Good music is a conversation. And the best conversationalists, they're the Eric Claptons of guitar, they're the Victor Wootens of bass, they're the, however you see musicianship in the way music is actually performed, I guarantee you it's a much deeper layer, especially for the performer, because what they're doing is they're opening up an opportunity to be vulnerable with their idea of musical progression. And just like the artist or the designer that sits down and paints or sculpts or draws, they're opening up. They're willing to be vulnerable with their expression. And whether that be music, art, or written form, all of these forms are fluid forms. Music feels more fluid because it's oral, and oral processing is the highest level of cognitive processing. So we hear it at a very, very deep level. Most people look at drawings and they don't hear the drawing in as deep a level. It takes a lot of time to really understand compositional depth. If you paint with oil painting, that method, of course, is very highly layered. So you learn very differently about how those layers affect each other. Even the layers that you think you no longer see in the underpaint, it impacts the paint that lies on the surface. So too with the way we construct and compositionally build things. There's in an automotive architecture, there's the surface, the skin that you see, but there's an underlying bone structure that creates tension around the surface, just like your hand is soft and flat here. And as you create tension around it, it pulls around that surface. That kind of surface integrity, those kinds of tensions, whether you do it on an actual surface or you build it in a CAD model, that kind of thinking, that kind of sensitivity to geometry is the same kind of sensitivity in musicianship, in sculpture, in painting. It's a multi-layered process of thinking and delivering in a way that is fluid and beautifully complex.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So how would you say it's developed over the years? Because obviously the way that you look at it as a child versus a high school student versus somebody at Art Center versus somebody now has probably changed considerably.
Yeah, my first indications of being interested in objects was as a little kid, and I was so frustrated because, like a lot of little kids, you're curious about stuff so much you want to touch it because your visual comprehension is not as well developed, but your sense of touch is highly developed. But the first things that my parents would tell me was, "Don't touch that." So I went, and a lot of my students, if I relate the story, they go, "Yeah, I remember as a kid, I wanted to touch everything, and my dad, don't touch that. That's fragile. Don't touch it." But that's how I understood things. So my mom was really good about it. For some reason, she understood. She would give me objects to touch and hold and rotate my hand to get to understand things. But there were things hanging from the ceiling I couldn't reach. And so I would study them and I would imagine in my head what they looked like as they rotated. So I had a lot of thinking about three-dimensional processing that was developing as a young person. That kind of fascination was just deeply, deeply embedded with curiosity. I didn't get out of that until I was in high school, when I had a much better understanding of how to impact that curiosity and actually put it to work, make things. So I had both the physical, let's say, dexterity to where I could take those ideas and start making things with them. Well, then I went through this whole period of just intense making where I had to build, 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 and my focus was making without impact. And this happens in other cultures. We still see archaeologists find mountains of arrowheads, hammered stones, which don't appear to have had any purpose, just mountains of them. But this is this intensity of creation that mankind has. So I moved from that period into the much more controlled period of managing that creative process and administering it in more of a focused way to where I could impact industry. And as I started out as a designer after I got out of school, I could see that I needed to understand a lot more about the mechanics of business and the mechanics of how design integrates into industry. And that's something that I've done a lot of work with students and grad students, understanding the business of design and how to actually take your ideas and go from just doing design as a job and making it more of a career, and then advancing from design as a career into design as a calling, to where you can do it from a broader life context, where you can actually design your life in the same way you can design a product. You can look at it, you can plan for its presence, you can be thoughtful about its past, and you can project for a successful future.
That's incredible. So what was the progression of that? So when did you first realize, oh, I can actually design my life? And how did you begin to implement that? Well, I guess first theoretically and then in practice.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges with design is that students will go and they'll listen to young designers talk about their career. And a designer with about 10 years of experience will speak very highly of how they got their first job, they expanded into being a design manager, then a design director or VP, and they might have accomplished that within their first 10 years of work. And they will speak with that narrow focus to young people who will believe that that is the way to achieve your goals as a designer. And it is a way, but it is not the way. So one of the things that we do as professional designers is we put way too much focus on working for Apple Computer or working for Ford Motor Company or becoming this high-end designer or a named designer, as though that's the key thing to experience as a designer. And it's just not true. There's so many other ways to actualize that. So it occurred to me after about 10 years of pushing myself into that context and making it something that I really deeply wanted to achieve, I had to kind of give up on that and break away from it. And that was about, for me, that was about 2000, maybe it was a little earlier, 98, 99. And I made a commitment to break away from it and start focusing on doing design practice that was more about what I really wanted, what I was willing to advocate for and push myself towards. But it took a long time to shake off that almost ingrained way of looking at design.
I think it's a really good point. And here's the thing here's the perspective that I have about it. I've worked for the big companies. Mm-hmm. And I thought it would make me, actually didn't think it would make me happy. I never thought for a second that it would make me happy, but I thought it would be like, oh, well, now I've made it and everybody's going to love me and everybody's going to want to hire me and it's going to be great. And everybody's going to think I'm so cool. And nobody cares.
Yeah. And the look, the truth is most of us don't get enough education about what true success is. There are 5 main successes. One of them is financial. One of them is relational. Another one is self, personal. And you go through these things and you begin to identify, you start to understand, well, wait a minute. I have I have relational success. I have a good family relationship. I have a wonderful spouse relationship. I have great friends. So I'm successful in that arena. Why do I put so much emphasis on financial success over friendships as a success, for example?
Yeah.
And same thing with career success. We put an enormous focus on career success. When in truth, if I ask you, well, let's just say you just graduated from a design school and you're looking for work. So you have a degree, but you don't have a job. And I meet you at a party and I say, so what do you do? And the answer usually for most students is, I studied design, but I'm currently looking for work. And that has nothing to do with what I asked in the question, which is, what do you do? And you can actually say, well, I'm a designer. The fact that you're not financially compensated for that doesn't matter. The same reason goes for people like, for example, Martin Luther King. If you met Martin Luther King at a social event and you said, hey, what do you do for a living? You think he would have turned to you and said, well, I'm a civil rights activist and I fight for the rights of all people and I believe in this and again. No. What would Gandhi have said? What was Gandhi's job? You know, did Gandhi have a career? No, we only know Gandhi through his historic reference and the fact that he stayed with the task so devoutly to be able to get to having a body of work that represented his passion. Same thing for a lot of people that commit to what they want to do, that advocate for what they believe in and follow through on that. They design their lives around the things that they believe in and the objects that they will fight for and the people they are impassioned by and the future that they see. That is great design, is being able to fulfill those things regardless of whether a company recognizes your fiscal value and pays you to do it.
That's exactly right. And that's why it's such a trap to put so much emphasis on that. I think one thing that I learned over time was that the hiring process is highly subjective. It's very random. And ultimately, your competence as a designer, in everyday life, people say, if you say you're a designer at Apple, it's assumed that you're probably the best of the best, and you probably are. But I bet you there are just as many designers who are just as good, who never worked at any company at all. In fact, we were talking about this before. You were mentioning, within the context of Western culture, sure, like the pinnacle is to be a designer at Apple. But what if you were born in Africa or something? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And it's all, this is one of the things that's really fascinating about design is that the context of our framework around design is that it is this very sort of westernized colonial way of looking at design success. And it's problematic because design as a profession was built around the foundation of industry. And industry for so many years has been white male dominated. So it's problematic institutionally to begin with. It's never been particularly embracing of a range of races or certainly gender. It's been a challenging profession in that regard. But even more so, it's equally challenging from a geographic perspective because the design work, for example, for Native Americans is absolutely beautiful in every way. If you look for the most effective, sustainable models of living, Native Americans still, to this day, hold some of the most amazing examples of sustainable living. And these are hundreds, if not thousands of years old, and they're refined to a level that we don't even understand because so many of the plants, animals, and ecosystems around that beautiful design are now just so fractured that they can't exist anymore. Same thing with Eastern cultures and the design impact for architecture. Some of the architecture that has long since vanished is just brilliant. brilliant stuff composed without violating any of the laws of nature. In fact, working within the laws of nature. If we look at, for example, even some of the most primitive cultures that were around, we tend to dismiss primitive cultures as not being evolved, but in fact, they're as evolved in their design quests and in design solutions because they've very, very effectively utilized every aspect of their natural resources without violating the sort of the terms of their geography. And that, again, that's one of those challenges that we have is, and this is where I always encourage designers, as you start your career, as you start your learning, do some hard work excavating your personal agenda. Try to figure out who you are and what you want out of what you're doing with your work, with your creative capacity. You have within you the most powerful tool, your brain, and the 3D manipulating equipment attached to you 100% of the time. So you have that capacity to have that impact. So how you want to administrate that impact is equally important as gathering the skills toward that administration.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. Let's talk about this a little bit.
Sure.
I think there's some interesting things around, how there is this sort of expectation that is very westernized. How would you advise approaching like, how do you diverge from that? So is it just about basically figuring out what it is that you want out of your life and why it is that you're designing? Do you think that's the first step, or is there more to it?
I think there are a couple of ways to excavate. We all have aspects of our personality to begin with that we think are important. And right now, the culture of personality seems to be very, very important. We have a lot of tools that allow for self-looking and look at me and look at this and look at what I've done. Those are personality. That's the first level of sort of inquisition. What is my personal feeling about who I am and what I want to do? A little deeper than that might be your spiritual feeling. And I'm not speaking about religion or God in any way. That's something that may be part of your spirituality and could be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. You can be agnostic and have a spiritual connection in different ways. And then another level of that might be, for example, your communal aesthetic. Is your family large, or is your friend community large, or are you more introverted in how you administrate your vulnerabilities? So understanding your equipment, so to speak, your machinery, and how it's built and what's right for it will help it produce in a more effective and more rewarding way. For example, if you're introverted and you're close-knit and you prefer to do your work mostly by yourself or in small groups, well, then working in a large company for Apple Computer, where you have to really aggressive schedules and very exposed work, that may not be the ideal place for you. Well, you wouldn't know that if you were shoved through the system and pushed yourself in sort of this hypnotic trance into believing this is where I need to be. And this is one of the things that's super, super important for students when they start interviewing for their jobs. They bring in magnificent portfolios. And I talk with many students when I see these portfolios are beautiful, they're brilliant, they've great ideas, good conceptual direction, but they don't have a story to tell. They don't have a driving compassion or a driving passion about where they want to be and how they want to get there. Not talking about career, talking about the broader picture about where you see yourself, not just as an individual in your community, but in the larger expansive community. Where are you on this in your geography? Where are you on this planet? Where are you in this universe? Where are you in the grander scheme of all things? You can have an impact on the entire shape of the galaxy. You absolutely can. You have that capacity. The question is, do you have the courage and willingness to go that deep, to see how you can make that impact?
So are you willing to bear it all and tell us what it is that drives you to impact the galaxy? Or do
Yeah,
you have any interest in impacting the galaxy? I guess that would be the first question.
yeah, I do. I have a lot of ongoing thought experiments, some of them now coming on 50 years of age, where I've been keeping track of sort of goals and objectives about what I want to achieve. And some of them are achievable within the context of how we understand physics and the permanence of objects, the permanence of self. So yeah, one of the things that I'm particularly dedicated to is thought process, and the idea that my thoughts, that I'm a vessel for these thoughts, and that I'm allowed this whatever 80, 90, 100-year duration to actualize these thoughts through this vessel, but that the thoughts have another agenda. And one of my goals is to try and be at least a part of that agenda once this vessel dissolves. So yes, it's a little philosophical, it's a little woo-woo and all that, but I do think that it's important as a designer that you think about that, because we address the issue of sustainability. And I think sustainability is important, but it's also important for your essence. What is the sustainable feature of you that you want to continue as you move along? And our physical messages, my voice, my presence will eventually dissipate. But I'd like to think that my thoughts and ideas, both in my students or in my family, in my community, within my geography, can be impacted, and maybe in a broader sense, greater impact as well. So yeah, and I think about all this stuff a lot, and I try to put it in sort of quantum packets for students to experiment with.
So what would you say? I guess the first question I have is, are you able to articulate it yet? Are you able to articulate what those goals are, or are you willing to right now?
Probably not yet. They change a lot. Initially, I had some goals for broader contexts of things. And for a lot of people, certainly a book is one way to convey it. I've been working on a book for some time, and it keeps changing, which is kind of funny, because that's the big challenge for me, is to try and kind of pick something that anchors. And one of the things I like about conversation is it can be very fluid. So I prefer that medium. And I think more and more that I'm moving further and further away from a solid artifact of what I believe in into a much more viscous artifact of thought and energy that I think can have a greater impact as I move, into whatever the next level is, or something like that. And we're getting awfully far out into the esoteric of this aspect, but believe it or not, and I want to kind of swing this all back into what a lot of the questions have been about, which is, how can I put together a killer portfolio? What do I say when I'm in an interview? Do you have any internships available? See, all of these questions are really good questions. They're fabulous questions, and they're pertinent to where we are in that tight context of where institutional design is, right in that tight funnel. And everybody has to be there. You have to be inside that in order to do it. But when you think about this image, this is a horse with a blinder on, and horses wear these blinders to limit their vision, so they're not seeing what's going on out here. And as a designer, it is important that you have that tunnel focus when you're gathering your skills. But once those skills are in your hand, what most designers refuse to do is they refuse to experiment with those skills. They refuse to really push themselves out there. Think about Picasso, who was a master realist painter for years. He could have had a career of 70, 80 years painting beautiful realistic portraits, but he broke himself, excuse me, he broke himself of that challenge to do that. And he left it behind so that he could do something different. And he wasn't the inventor of Cubism. He simply leveraged Cubism in a way that had his courage behind it. Same thing with a lot of great thinkers and innovators. Oprah Winfrey, fabulous innovator who took emotional conversation and the vulnerability of women, particularly women, into the public conversation. And she made it something that people were drawn to. Absolutely brilliant. And you look at any innovator, and what you'll find is that they thought about, they gathered their skills, they built their skills in a way that they could understand. And once they understood that they were in that tunnel, they immediately broke away from it. Because nothing wrong with the tunnel. It's great. It'll pay your bills, it'll get you a nice car, it'll do all those things, but it won't get you out of the tunnel. That's the problem with it. And trust me when I tell you, I've been in the tunnel, I've driven super fast through it. The minute you get out of it, the world and the journey is so much more fulfilling. And that's why great questions about the portfolio, about my designs, should I include this? How many items should be on my portfolio? Absolutely, all that stuff is very important. But give yourself the opportunity to get outside that context so you can really expand the larger design question and answer that for yourself, not just as a job, but as a way to live your life.
That's kind of a place that I've been in more recently. Through my freelance work and just through COVID, I've been afforded a lot of time to think. And that's something that I'm very grateful for.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I would not wish for this to ever happen, but it did. So, you know, there's been a lot of time to reflect on, you know, what I want. And at this point, for me, you know, of course, there are much better designers than me. I would never say that I'm a solid designer, but the point of this is that I'm kind of at a point where I'm pretty competent, and now it's like, all right, well, I can spend another 1,000 hours getting 0.1% better and like fighting, you know, to go from like 95% to 95.1, and then spend another 2,000 hours to get to 95.2. And then maybe if I get to 97% after, you know, 5 years, I'll get a job at Apple or something. I'm starting to think like maybe there's something else there in terms of just some sort of divergent thinking, kind of like Picasso with Cubism.
Sure.
And I don't know what it is, but it's definitely an interesting thought.
Well, and I think one of the benefits of having this much time to review and have the introspection is that we begin to realize where we are. And, you know, again, for young people, they spend so much of their lives in these compartments. I'll go to middle school, I'll go to high school. After that, I go to college, then I get a job, maybe I'll get married, maybe I'll get an apartment, then I'll get a house, then I'll have a car, then I'll on and on and on, all inside these compartments that are bracketed around these achievement-oriented things, including saving money for retirement so that you have plenty of money to retire, and which is a completely convoluted thing. And I have a whole other design context around that as well, because it should go in reverse. The money should be there for young people, right? So that young people are encouraged to travel, for goodness sakes. Travel is one of the most eye-opening experiences you can have, but young people can't travel. And as a designer, it's key. I tell students that come out of school and they say, well, okay, I want to get an internship. I say, you know what? Here's the best internship you'll ever take. If you have X amount of money, ask your parents to help you with a little bit more, or work for the summer, save up this much money, and then go blow every freaking dime of it and go to Germany, go to Italy, go to China, go to the Philippines, go to wherever your heart decides that you need to go, and live the experiences there outside of your tunnel. That's,
You know how this contrasts so drastically from the general convention of, like, as it relates to, you know, success, blah, blah, blah.
yeah,
But I guess the point is that there are many ways to measure success, and career success is really just one metric.
right. And what we see oftentimes is we have a situation like this where John Mauriello will talk with Raffi Minasian, and I'm supposed to impart wisdom to young people by saying, do this, do this. Now, when you get to this age, do that. And then they'll go, oh, he did it the right way. I'm going to do it like, it's not a right way.
No, that's exactly right. That's the whole point. The whole point is that nobody's supposed to be telling you what to do, especially as a designer. You're supposed to figure it out.
Exactly. And John, that's a brilliant message. That's exactly right. You are supposed to figure it out. And guess what? Nobody knows how to do it. I didn't know how to do it. I stumbled over half the things and went, look at that. You know, I picked out, luckily, when I had the opportunity, I picked out the right Jolly Rancher wrappers. And because I was able to do that out of the water, I got the right waves to ride. I don't know if they would have been the right waves for someone else. Maybe they were. Maybe they were there all the time. Maybe they only came along when I was there picking the wrapper out of the water. I don't know. But they came and I acknowledged them and I moved forward with them. The fact that my work looks like a career now is a nice outcome, but it's also the story I tell, because I may also tell the story of being a failed violinist, because when I was, playing in the orchestra and practicing really hard, I was only able to advance this much. And so somebody might look at well, he's kind of a failed violinist because he's not in an orchestra. He's never performed as a solo violinist. His recordings haven't sold many, and so they might be right about that. But it's not how I define my success with that instrument. Just like it's not how I define my success with this instrument. And all of those types of engagements, we fall into the trap of believing that this is what I need because that's what everybody else has told me the script is supposed to be. But you don't have to construct your life narrative around what other people tell you it should be. It is your life narrative that you are framing. And as a designer, it's your opportunity to reach into yourself and reach out into your future. Those two dimensions exist concurrently. The in and the out of who you are a concurrency of where you are right now and where you will be in the future. And I'm not suggesting that any of us have control over that. But if we can be present in where we are and where we wish to be and have that kind of mindset around what we do, then you will unfold your career in the way that it's supposed to be. You will find your calling and you will have designed your life.
Yeah, that's great, Raffi. I really like that. So I think what we can do next is we can go through some of those questions that might yield more nuanced answers. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay, 1 second. Let me just pull them up.
All right.
Atul asks, the client list you have worked with is so diverse with strong cultural and historic identity, from Rolls-Royce to McDonald's. As a designer, where does one start in each of these cases? Do we reset or unlearn ourselves each time? And importantly, how does one ensure that one's signature approach or style matches the brand's language? That's interesting.
Yeah, so these are great questions. So the answer to that is, imagine, Atal, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Imagine you're at a party. Now, before you go to that party, you know that what that party is going to be like, so you get dressed accordingly. And then you arrive at the party, and like most of us, you're not quite sure what's going on. There might be a few people there, but as time goes on, you start to feel more comfortable. You might get something to drink. You've now spoken to a few people, but each person you've spoken to along the way has their own unique story. So let's just say the first person you talk to is one brand. So as you talk to that person, you're introducing who you are to the brand of that person, and that person is expressing their brand back to you. So you have an opportunity in that conversation to understand your place in that person's brand. As you go to the next conversation, you do bring along a little bit of that first brand conversation into the second one. There's no escaping it. So in the same way for me, when I work with this diverse group of clients, I try to remember the conversations I've had with other brands, but I also try to keep that brand integrity. I try to keep that conversation special so that when I sit down to work on their brand, I make sure that I'm not speaking about the brand or developing product that's too far outside their brand comfort. So for example, if I met my friend's mother at the party, I would probably choose to brand my vocalizations to my friend's mother in a different way from speaking to my friend. But it would not limit the information that I give to the brand of his mother, because what's important in design is that you deliver good quality without worrying about how it impacts the brand. So even if, and this is an important thing to think about, good quality design might not match that brand, but that's okay because your client wants to see your opinion. Now, the question of style and personal style, for me, it doesn't matter. I don't have a style. People have asked me that for years. What's your style? I don't have a style. I don't want a style. I want to be able to capture what the world feels like it needs this product to be, and then give it an embodiment, whether it's a sculptural, physical, functional embodiment, or a combination of that suits that brand.
That's a great answer. I also agree. I don't really have a style either. I mean, people have asked me, what's your design style? And I always just say whatever fits the brief.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of true. And, in a way, it really is. If you're truly a designer, then that's what the answer should be. Because otherwise, unless you're an in-house designer, like a corporate designer that works for Apple, well, let's face it, Apple's not going to do wood grain sided iPhones.
Right.
And if you walked in there and started doing wood grain sided iPhones, you better have a really good brand perspective on how to execute that. Otherwise, you're probably not going to be working there for a long time.
Yeah, very true. What are the biggest misconceptions students or beginners have about the job as an industrial designer? And I know that this one's a little bit more narrow, Raffi,
Yeah.
but I think it's bears mentioning anyway, assuming you have a somewhat traditional industrial design job.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think a lot of misconceptions are built around the framework of I'm going to walk into the studio, sit down, start drawing, I'll sketch, and then I'll work on the computer, and then I'll gradually start getting a concept. We'll pin it up in a room, and then people will pick, and then it'll eventually become something. And that's a part of what we do, but it's a misconception that the continuity of flow is at the pace of student projects. That's one of the biggest problems, is that it's not. I tell my students all the time, if you have 4 design classes happening in 15 weeks, this is the hardest you're ever going to work. Once you get out and start working, especially in a corporate environment, you'll be astonished at how slow it goes.
It's glacial.
What's that?
It's glacial.
So that's one of the first misconceptions, is that when I went to work at Boeing, I came from a freelance background. I did freelance work for 2 years, and I worked in a studio that fed me a lot of freelance volume. And boy, you got a project on Monday and it was due on Wednesday. So we really had a fast pace. So when I went to Boeing, the first 3 weeks, I walked in there and I sat down. I was drawing like a madman every day. I had my lunch at my desk. I just kept going and going. And finally, my boss came to me and said, you need to slow down. You're making people a little nervous. There's a little too much going on here. And 2 years later, a concept that I had done was finally a mock-up. And then 5 years later, it was finally built as a prototype for testing and got patent approval. 5 years. So it is a misconception that you think your product is going to come out rather quickly and that most of your work that you'll be doing will be conceptual, and that no, there's a lot of sit down and have conversations with engineers that lead nowhere. There's a lot of lengthy discussions over the politics of how your work is going to be administrated through certain divisions. And there's a lot of boss work going around talking about whether they want you on this project or over on this project. And well, this person did really well on this one, let's have them come here. There's a lot of that.
One thing that I want to add to this, oh, by the way, who was it that asked this? Oh, just M. So M, one thing to keep in mind is that it's heavily dependent on the company that you work for. Absolutely. So Boeing is probably among the most corporate of the corporate and political of the political. Yep. So I've never worked there, but I would imagine that's what it's like, just knowing. I actually have a sister-in-law who works there. She hasn't said anything to me negative about it, by the way, but I just get that impression based on what she has told me. So just something to keep in mind. There is sort of a scale. So freelance is at one extreme, and then Boeing is like way over on the other end.
Yeah.
So that's something to just keep in mind.
And that's something to also keep in mind as you start your work, because a lot of students get out and start looking for work and they end up in a corporate environment and they find it's not for them and they don't know why. They think maybe they can't cut it, or they think or they get bored. And that's a common thing. The average designer comes out of school and goes to work. If they get a job right out of school, after 2 years, you query them and they're frustrated because the activity, the action, the give back, it's just not endorphin enough, because it can be a little bit challenging trying to manage that, which is why it's so important to understand and adjust your expectations around those needs.
Yeah, definitely. I can most certainly agree with that. And I think that depending on the company, once again, you could end up just doing grunt work basically and just doing sketches all day. Or you could end up doing like CAD for weeks on end at a junior level, or just really more executing than actual, designing or conceptual development. So that's another thing that you might consider as well. That depends on the job, but it's just something to keep in mind. And you should probably ask the prospective employer what it is that they hope for you to do. Like, how will you benefit the company? If they're asking a lot about technical skills and that seems to be the focus, then that's what you're going to do. You're going to be doing renderings and 3D CAD and stuff like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I do that professionally sometimes too, even now still. In fact, I'm doing a project for Raffi right now that is just that. That's fine. Yeah. I mean, it's not something I would want to do as my only project, but it's fine to kind of change the pace, think on a more technical level. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
Well, the other thing to keep in mind too is you have to be careful because when you get into a company and you do something really well, that's the thing they're going to want you to do a lot. Because the minute your boss is aware that you do something really well, either efficiently or quickly or faster than others, that's what you're going to be doing, because their job is to turn your talent into money. That's it, plain and simple. That's what they're there to do. When they look at your portfolio, they're only looking for two things. Number one, do you have talent? Number two, can they make money with your talent? That's it. And so if those two things are possible, you will get a job. But once you sit down and start doing that work, the minute they figure out the thing that you do better than anything else, that's what you're going to be doing.
That's
so
right.
You have to be careful about how you reveal your skills.
Yeah. So on that note, let's just say you have a lot of packaging work and you're very experienced in that, but you hate packaging. Don't show packaging in your portfolio.
Yeah.
This is by ED or Ed. It's E space D. All right, Ed. So having worked for such a broad array of companies, how did his knowledge of one industry translate to another? What hurdles did he have to overcome in the process? So this is sort of similar to the other one, but it's it's a little bit different because there might be some interesting discussion around cross-pollination and how, you basically have these conversations with other people or companies. Like how did they translate to each other? Because obviously, you've done cars, you've done Happy Meals.
Yeah.
Like how did those sort of blend or cross-pollinate?
Well, it's very interesting. The toy industry, when I worked for probably total about 4, maybe 5 years in the toy industry, depending on how you define toys. One of the reasons why I enjoyed doing toys so much is because in the car industry, we'd start out and you'd do sketches, you'd do concepts, you'd work. It was very slow. It'd take 2, 3, 4 years before you'd really start to see any kind of impact. But with toys, boom, super quick. You'd sketch it out, they'd see it, they'd love it. It'd go out, get prototype. Before you know it, it's on the shelf. You'd be like, oh, look at what I did. So with that, what I found is that the toy industry made me a better car designer because I was able to hang on to that enthusiasm and energy much longer. So I was able to sustain that kind of enthusiasm for conceptual work and push myself sort of in a tighter toy perspective, knowing that that's how it would be. The other thing that the toy industry does a tremendous job of, and again, I always recommend students get into it at least a little bit, is you can't do toys without being happy. There's no such thing as a sad toy designer. A good toy designer is like excited to be with kids, thinking about play. You're lying on the floor like a 3-year-old and looking at blocks. And that's just so freaking great. And you get that energy and you translate it into working for Boeing. And so it doesn't end up on an airplane, but it ends up with the people you work with. So the engineers I worked with, they would laugh in the meetings because of some of the ideas I would come up with because they were so ridiculous. But then we would have a conversation about it. And sure enough, we would all agree that it would be okay to investigate that. So we'd put it together, we'd frame it to the boss, we'd show it to the boss. The boss would think we were nuts, but the boss even found it was fun and interesting. And then it became not only more fun to do that work, but it started to feel like you were having a greater impact. So method is a really good thing to take from one job to another and take those methods and move them along. When I went from Boeing and I went into another industry completely different from Boeing, I was able to harness some of the processes and some of the methods of thinking and orchestrating large teams and put that into smaller companies. And I was able to do a lot of really effective product management using some of those Boeing resources that I learned from that really rigid way of doing things. Because I mean, they're making airplanes. You want to keep things pretty rigid, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, great question, Ed or ED, whatever you want us to call you. So this is from Shalak Mishra. He's actually in the Discord chat a lot. So shout out to Shalak. I'm probably pronouncing your name wrong. I'm really sorry. You can DM me in Discord and tell me how to pronounce it properly. I'm sorry. But what are the skills which set you apart from the rest of the designers? And the second part is like, what the heck? How can a freshman apply to a company like IKEA or Kiska? I don't know about the second part, but I think the first part is interesting. If you want, you can answer the second part too, I guess, but I wouldn't know how to.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to answer the second part first because I think it's interesting in the context that he asks it. I think the most important skill for any designer is courage, plain and simple. I'm not afraid of anything. There's no reason to be afraid of things that are involved in my creative spectrum. Now, there are a lot of things out there in the world that can hurt you. Those things are scary, but in the creative context, there's no reason to be afraid. And yet we bring our fear into our creative way of thinking because it's part of our aesthetic. So I worked very hard to excise my natural fear of a lot of bad things out there in the world from my creative force. And that sort of answers the other part of the question, which is you have to train your courage to apply in the right places. I don't want my courage coming out when a man with a gun is standing in front of me asking for my wallet. So I train my courage to step back and assess the situation and relieve myself of my wallet because I can get another wallet. So I don't have blind courage, but I apply my courage very tactfully. I apply my courage in a way that has a focus, and that focus is for my creative expansion. So that is the thing that I think I have used throughout my career. I'm not afraid to go in front of a group of grade 20 level Boeing engineers and present a wacky idea because I'm armed with the creative courage to do that and the skills to follow through on that. I'm not afraid of my conceptual integrity being misunderstood and making myself vulnerable in front of a community of people because I know that if they don't accept it, that's okay. I'll move on to another geography that might. So that answers the second part of the question, which is how does a freshman get to IKEA? The answer is courage. Because how does IKEA get to IKEA? Courage. The people that built IKEA were courageous enough to do it. They were freshmen at one time too. So that's possibly your angle, is to go there with the courage that says, I'm not a freshman coming to IKEA. I'm somebody with the courage to see who I am inside and the person I'm going to be in the future. And I'm going to bring that opportunity to a company. And it's their job to refuse that future. And my job to move away from it and say, that's okay. I'll move on to another geography. I'll move on to another culture. I'll move on to another experience and time frame that may accept me.
Somebody asked if you are looking for interns. No.
I will say this. If you want an internship and you cannot find one, the best internship you can do is if you can't afford travel, and I do highly recommend travel as an internship, absolutely, and structure it, build it as an internship, and put it together. Do a one-page piece of paper and present it to your family, and say, "Look, here's my internship. Here's how I'd like to do it. You are going to be my first client. You're going to be the person that hires me to go out and do this internship, and you're going to pay me $1,500, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to have this experience." We limit ourselves to structured internships. So we go out and we look for an internship that's already made, but in truth, some of the best internships are the ones that you create yourself.
I agree 100%. That my personal projects have developed my design sensibilities far more than anything that I did professionally. Now, of course, I was able to apply it professionally, but it wasn't through professional work that I really learned a lot as a designer, although it certainly helps. So the last question that I have is, this is the last one for real, by Joseph London. First, where should I start? I feel like I'm struggling to make headway as a pre-college designer because nowadays, even to get to a design school, you need a portfolio, which seems ludicrous to me. Where do I start? That's a good one.
That's a really good question. So if you don't want to go to college to be a designer, that's okay. Most of the most successful designers didn't go to college. College and the design education is probably maybe 50, 60 years old from a formal perspective. So most of the designers that have had huge impact in industrial design didn't have the formal education. They were trained in architecture. They might have done materials studies. They might have been engineers that took sculpture classes. So the idea that you have to limit yourself by getting that education is it's erroneous. Again, Gandhi didn't go to Gandhi school to learn how to be Gandhi. He decided what he wanted to do and pursued a life that had that direction. So if what you want to do is be a car designer, you don't need the validation of a car company to do that or be that. Now, if you want to gain facility with tools that are accepted in the industry and used in the industry on a regular basis, and your proficiency in those tools is important to you, then schooling is a great way to go. because you're able to get proficiency with those tools, both by having an instructor that guides you through it and having the sort of the pressure of the rest of all the fish swimming in the same direction, because that's effectively what a classroom is. Everybody agrees to jump in the water and swim in this direction. And I keep looking over my shoulder and seeing that person swimming a little further past me, and I'm paddling a lot faster. That's the momentum that college gives you, is you're immersed in that culture, you're immersed in that geography, and it pushes you in a way that is very difficult to do by yourself. So you can do it on your own. You can do it within a community of fabricators or artisans, and you can build your portfolio that way, or you can go to school and experience it from that context. But the one thing that I'll say in answering your questions, or in answering your question, and John, if you still have it up on the screen, would you read the first part of his question?
Yes. So he asked, where should I start? I feel like I'm struggling to make headway as a pre-college designer
right
because
there.
nowadays, even to get to a design school, you need a portfolio. So yeah, it's like, where should I start?
So his first part of the question was, where should I start? And then he went from start to struggle. So just in terms of looking at the wording and the structure of his composition, he says he doesn't know where to start. Well, here's the thing, you've already started. So you're already on the journey. The fact that you identify that the beginning of your journey is already immersed in struggle tells me that you're not being courageous on it. Because if you're frightened, you're stepping back. Usually people who are struggling because they're fearful of something. If you release yourself from your struggle, if you pull away from the tension around something that is binding you, the binding will cease. It's just the natural order of things. And once you pull yourself inward enough so that there is no struggle, and you bring yourself in on your own universe singularity, then once you're inside as deeply as you can be, all that is around you binding you dissipates. And then all that's left is the explosion of your universe growing outward and expanding into your own future. That's where you begin.
That is exactly right. And I can speak personally to the accuracy of that statement. So I agree 100%. John Mauriello backed. One thing I do want to mention is that if you want to go through a traditional design sort of career where you work at a big consultancy or you work at a big car company, the best way to do that is to go to school. I think, and Raffi, correct me if I'm wrong, I think your point is that there are a lot of other ways to participate in the design process that don't include working at, Frog or IDEO or, getting a job at Toyota or whatever else. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely. And listen, because our work is so highly skills based, you really do benefit from the teaching, and getting the focus and clarity from an institution is super, super helpful, because so much of what we do involves some pretty sophisticated tools, understanding of software, utilizing that software effectively, updating your work and maintaining a strong portfolio. All of those things are habits and disciplines you learn while you're in school. It is really the way for someone who has that interest and passion. And folding that, getting that education and bringing it together, very, very important. I had an education. I went to UCLA and got a 4-year degree in industrial design. Then I went to Art Center and got a 4-year degree in transportation design. And I put those two together to do the work I wanted to do, because each one individually did not satisfy what I wanted. So I had to put those two things together. And ultimately, when I got out of school, I thought, I'm a designer and I'm ready to go. And I went and I sat down and I started work, and I worked in a company for like 2-3 months before the light finally went on. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is how I'm supposed to work. It took me that long to figure out, months to see myself working professionally. And little by little, those pieces came together. And each time in my career, there's been various epiphanies sort of helping me figure out where I want to be in that next step and that next iteration of my design career.
Yeah, it's a great answer. All right, Raffi. Well, we're at just about 6 o'clock. Are there any last parting words or a parting statement that you'd like to give to the audience?
Yeah, I'll leave with this, and this is something that is part of a lecture that I've given for several years, and I think it's something that's super important to designers to hear and understand, and that is that you have basically 600,000 hours in an average human lifetime. That is a lot of time, but a third of that time you'll spend sleeping, and a third of that time you'll spend working. So 200,000 hours basically remain for you to enjoy your life. The more you're able to enjoy the work you do and blend your joy with your career, you basically are doubling the impact you have on increasing your happiness. You may not get the full 100% of that doubling effect, but by beginning to understand what is important to you, how you actualize and visualize and put together those constructs for work and play at the same time, that's a really, really deep and important thing to do, not just at the beginning of your career, but throughout your entire career, so that you are spending as much time enjoying the work you do and bringing that work into a world, into a future that will be beautiful, fruitful, and beneficial for mankind.
That was beautiful, Raffi. Thank you so much. That was amazing. So I think we're just about at 6 o'clock. I want to thank you again for your time, Raffi. That's going to be a tough one to top. If you ever want to do this again, let me know. You should just start your own podcast or video series. That's what you should really do. But, I know that you want to make the best use of your time. So if it's not something that interests you, I understand. But that's what you should do. That's just my opinion.
Well, I'm happy to do it again, John. And thanks to all of you who wrote your questions in ahead of time. I apologize if we weren't able to get to them. We can certainly do it again. And if you guys need more down and dirty specifics on drawing, rendering, CAD programs, design, the making of things, we can happily go through that step too. I'd be happy to do it again, John.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raffi. All right. I'm going to turn off the recording really quick.